universities, 15 Nobel laureates have signed up, me. And I encourage everyone, if you want the candidates to actually have a meaningful debate about issues of science, from stem cells to funding to space, whatever it is, if you're tired of just hearing about what they're going to talk about, the talking points you hear about, I encourage you to go to Science Debate 2008, sign your name. There are plans to actually have the debate at the National Academy of Sciences in Washington, D.C. sometime early in the fall. So I encourage everyone to go there. Can you tab over to my website?
Very cool. Can we get that info on your website?
Yes, thank you. Great transitions. This is my website, sciencecafesf.com. You'll find a blog with all sorts of information related to solar right now, as well as links to Science Debate, links to other science information sites, and it's the best place to learn more about what's coming up at these events. There's a mailing list that I'm going to be passing around. If you're not on the mailing list, sign up. It's a great way. It's the best way to keep abreast of what's going on. You'll get about 3 or 4 emails a month and a newsletter. And with that being said, I'm going to introduce the speaker. Well, first of all, are there any other questions before we move on? I am going to plug one more thing. There's a blog post that I wrote about the meditation event from 2 months ago. And it is an amazing, amazing story. And I wrote a piece about it on my website. I encourage you to go check it out. It is a really powerful story about how one woman was affected at the meditation event. And I encourage everyone to read it, and I'll tell you a little more about it maybe on the break, so come talk to me. Without further ado, though, we're going to get right into the science of solar tonight. I'm going to introduce our speaker for the night. He is co-founder and CTO of Sun Power, and his name's Dick Swanson. He's going to come up and take it from here. Let's give him a big hand.
Wow, this is amazing. I've never. This takes a cake.
You have to talk pretty close to the mic for it to work.
Gee, you really do. This is incredible. I've never seen anything like this. This looks like I was expecting like 3 people down here, and then everybody else. You know, it's like the ultimate nightmare. You go to a restaurant, and the guy with the violin comes by, and you try and ignore him, but thanks all for coming. This is exciting. I'm really pleased to be able to talk to you a little bit about the background of Sun Power, and I have an outline of my talk here. If you look at it, so
really quickly, I'm going to jump in. Can everyone hear and see?
This isn't very loud.
Can't hear very well.
You turn me up. Yeah. Okay. Is that better?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So I thought I'd go a little bit over the history of photovoltaics, the early days, and kind of how we got where we started and how we got to where we are, and discuss how we've made the transition from just powering satellites in space to almost a mainstream energy source. A little bit about the dynamics of the market. And I've got a picture show of just applications. Probably if you're interested in solar, you've seen many of these. I'll just try and flip through it just to give you a flavor for the kind of things that people are doing with solar panels these days. And then finally, at the request of our host, I'm going to talk a little bit about how solar cells actually work, because this is supposed to be a science cafe, right? See how that goes. So go to the first slide. Really, you can trace the beginning of the terrestrial PV business to the oil embargo in 1973. Prior to that, solar cells were used for powering satellites. There were a few people that were thinking about using them on Earth, but they were hopelessly expensive. And then we had this big oil embargo. There was a president back then by the name of Jimmy Carter who declared that we needed to solve the energy crisis, and it was the moral equivalent of war. There was a tremendous amount of enthusiasm back then. I got into the solar business in 1973, essentially because of the oil embargo. You know, standing, I don't know if you've seen pictures, but the lines for the gas stations could go many, many blocks and take half a day to get there. So you had a lot of time to think about what you wanted to work on, and I decided to get into solar at that time. But there was a real feeling that we would surely figure out how to do this quite quickly, and within a few years we'd have these giant solar farms in the desert. This is I try to capture that. This person on the left is the first director of the National Renewable Energy Lab. It was called SERI back then in Golden, Colorado, and he's sort of pitching the president about it. And the guy on the right is now the technical director of that laboratory. He was there back then, and he knew that we had quite a lot of work ahead of us. So if you look at the situation at the time of the oil embargo and looked at how a solar cell was made, what you found was a very complicated and expensive process. We started with sand, basically, and removed the oxygen to get silicon. And then we purified that silicon to the most pure substance that man has ever made. You know, the silicon that's refined for making these things has parts per trillion of impurities in it. It's more pure than anything man has ever succeeded in making any other element. And then we grow it into these big ingots. So melt it down in a pot, pull a crucible out, which goes painstakingly slow, kind of creeps up in a millimeter per minute kind of rate, and makes a crystal of silicon. It's sort of like a salt crystal when you make it in a saturated salt solution. That ingot, by the way, is the largest and most perfect crystal that man has ever made. If you look at that ingot of silicon, the atomic planes at one end of this rod are lined up with those 6 feet away at the other end of the rod within an atomic dimension. So these are essentially perfect, very large single crystals. It turns out silicon is very hard. It's one of the hardest substances there is, and the only thing that'll cut it is diamond or silicon carbide, just barely. So we have to saw it into wafers. Back then, we cut the ingot into a wafer with something that looked like a salami slicer, and it took many minutes to slice off a wafer out of this ingot. Then you had to do the next wafer. And then you had to turn those wafers into solar cells, put those into panels, and put those on the top of a system, of a roof or something. When you're all done, it cost about $200 a watt to do this. So everyone in the field looked at this and said, there's no way this is ever going to be cost effective. I mean, this process is just hopelessly complicated, laborious, energy consumptive, and expensive that we can never turn this into a viable energy source. As a result of that, go to the next slide, please. The field really decided that we needed a big breakthrough. Okay, so something needed to be done. It's missing an arrow here. This is the translation, I think, from one PowerPoint to the other. But everyone in the field, including myself, felt that some kind of giant breakthrough was needed. We couldn't make this process work. And the field split into two camps. On the one hand, we had the thin film camp. The thin film people said, well, this is all too difficult, so therefore we'd like to just make a thin layer of solar material, maybe on glass, maybe on plastic, and ultimately bypass all those expensive steps. And the ultimate vision was that maybe the solar cell would come in a spray can, you know, and you'd buy it like at Home Depot and spray it on your roof and plug the wires in. So that was sort of the thinking of the thin film kind of abstracted away. Those of us that were more practical realized that it would actually, if you know anything about solar cells, it would take two spray cans, a positive and a negative spray can. But anyway, that was the idea. The other camp said, well, these solar cells are way too expensive. Instead of trying to make them in a spray can, let's focus more light on them. Let's shrink the size of the cell by cramming a lot of light on it with mirrors or lenses or something like that, and thereby get a lot more power out of this expensive solar cell. So everyone marched off, all these scientists and engineers trying to work on these two approaches, and they all had in their mind an end market that was called a solar farm. Solar farm was a giant thing in the desert that generated 1 billion watts of electric power. So we all wanted to make solar farms. That was the vision. It was going to be who got their solar farm working first was the basic idea. The existing market at that time was, we call it remote habitation or remote commercial. That was the bread and butter for what very small PV market existed back then. This is things like powering repeater stations on top of mountains, or huts in Africa creating a fluorescent light and things like that. But the solar farm was thought to be the big win. The interesting thing is, as so often happens in the history of technology, this is not what happened. We go to the next slide, and you can see what really happened was the U.S. Department of Energy said, well, we know that it's going to take 3 or 4 years for the thin film to come along, and 3 or 4 years for the concentrator to come along, so therefore we should work on the standard solar cell process, the one I described to you, that laborious process. We should do a little work on that just to help those guys out that are trying to do this and see if we can drive some cost out of the solar cell. They started what's called the DOE Wafered Silicon Program, and it was administered through the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena. All the panels you buy today basically came out of that program. All of the technology for making a modern solar panel was perfected within the JPL solar program. The next thing that happened was people discovered, hey, you don't really want to put these panels in the middle of the desert, generate 1 billion watts, and then try and figure out how to transport it all to Los Angeles. The neat thing about PV is you can put it on your roof. You can generate it power right where you need it. This came to be called distributed generation, or customer side of the meter generation. You put the panel on your side of the meter and thereby reduce your electric power consumption, or grid connected PV. In any case, because the value of electricity is so much higher to the end customer than in the middle of the desert, what was a big leap of faith in getting the cost low enough suddenly wasn't that big of a gap. A utility today might pay 3 to 5 cents a kilowatt hour for bulk power at a big power plant, and they'll sell it to you for 12 to 15 cents a kilowatt hour. So there's a big difference, a factor of 3 or more, in the value of it if you just put it on your roof. And solar is uniquely capable of doing that when you compare it with most other energy generating operations. So if we go to the next slide, we can see the growth of the market, and it kind of goes through some interesting transitions. The first megawatt, this is megawatts per year of production versus year. The first year we actually, as an industry, made more than a megawatt was in 1979. And ARCO actually made that, ARCO Solar. But it's kind of an interesting story, since we can tell stories here. They didn't have any market. In fact, the ARCO started making solar cells, and their predecessor company was called Solar Technologies International. And guys started showing up buying them with pickup trucks. And they paid cash. So they were kind of wondering, you know, where all these panels were going. They eventually discovered they were all going to Humboldt County to power marijuana farms, right? And so I don't think there's a whole lot of different industries out there that could say, we got our start growing marijuana. It was sort of like, oh, no, don't ask, don't tell, just keep shipping these modules. In any case, they finally got their factory running well enough that it made too many modules. I'll tell you that story in a minute. But there was a period here of tremendous entrepreneurial explosive growth in the early days where the industry was really growing fast. And then in 1983, it suddenly stopped and went to a much slower growth rate. Can you remember back what happened in 1983? Reagan, right. So Carter was out, Reagan came in, and he thought this was just total bunk. He cut the federal budget for our research into solar from the prior year, $180 million to 27, 1 year, boom. Most of my friends that got into the field with me at that time had to exit. I feel very fortunate. I sort of begged, borrowed, and stealed and managed to stay in solar through that period. But in any case, there was a period of moderate growth in here where basically the oil companies bought up all the solar companies, and I'll talk about that in a minute. And then you see that inflection in 1995. That was the discovery of the killer app, if you will. That's when we discovered you should not put these in solar farms, you should put them on people's roofs. And the market just started to explode. Since then, we've been growing, it says 41% compound annual growth since then, but actually more recently it's over 50% for over 5 years. Just a truly explosive growth, and it's all going into this homeowner and residential type applications. Next slide. So I kind of, having been through this, I like to look back on what we've done and what happened, and I kind of divide the eras up like this. 1975 to 85 was really the startup time. The industry was dominated by small startups, companies, and Solar Technology International, Solar Power Corporation, SolarX, and Tyco were the biggest ones. And it was characterized by dynamic, rapid growth. In 1985, the oil companies started buying them up. You can see that all of the original players were bought by oil companies. Solar Technology by Arco, Solar Power Corporation by Exxon, SolarX by BP, and Tyco by Mobil Corporation. So the oil companies came in a big way. They weren't really sure why they wanted to be in this business, but they knew how to at least pronounce energy, and so they got into it, but they really mucked it up in a big way for everybody. Arco Solar, over its period that it owned the company, lost at least $500 million in its solar venture. Nobody talks about how much exactly they lost, but I'm sure it's at least $500 million. I was going to give you a little anecdote about how little these guys knew. So the oil companies, I was talking to an executive one time, and we were talking about how they don't really have much to offer manufacturers. He said, yeah, we really don't know anything about manufacturing. He said, our core competency is very simple. It's carrying big bags of cash and putting them in a bank. You know, that's kind of what they know how to do. And it's really illustrated with what they did with Arco Solar. Arco Solar was still the same old people that had formed Solar Technologies International. And so they built this line and they started making more modules than there were marijuana farms. And they were trying to figure out what to do with them. So they didn't want to lay everybody off. They had come to the conclusion that the way to make panels is kind of interesting. The guy that founded it, he looked at a solar cell, you know, it was a little chip-like thing, and it was about the same size as a taco. So he went down and he hired everybody for his production line from Taco Bell. Just said, come on over, we're going to make solar cells. So he was making solar cells, but there were too many of them, so he started putting them in a warehouse. And they started filling up a warehouse. Well, I don't know how many of you have been involved in manufacturing, but this is not considered state-of-the-art concept about how to run a factory, is to just fill up warehouses with your product. On the other hand, Arco was pleased as punch. And the reason is that Arco had no place on its balance sheet to put work in process or inventory. But they did have something that they thought was similar enough, and that's an oil reserve, right? So Arco Solar got plopped into the oil reserve, and not only was it an oil reserve, it was one that is expanding on its own. So accounts at Arco Solar were just thought Arco parent thought Arco Solar was just doing great guns because they were expanding their oil reserve. But anyway, the oil companies played around with it for a while. They kind of traded them back and forth. They would get tired of it and sell it to a new one. They passed them around kind of like baseball cards is the best way I can see. You know, I got one PV company here, you know, I'll trade you for it. So they created a situation where there were massive losses because they knew nothing about manufacturing. And this made it very difficult for startups. I founded SunPower in 1985, right at the beginning of this. So this was kind of like the worst conceivable timing, because we were competing with oil companies with huge reserves, and we're losing hundreds of millions of dollars on this business. So, and willing to lose hundreds of millions of dollars on this business. So there weren't any startups in that period. If you go to the next slide, we go to the time when the Japanese companies came in. So the Japanese companies started waltzing in 1995, and they showed how to do the manufacturing. They really transitioned our company from these funny little startups that happened to be owned by oil companies into the modern age of manufacturing. And started bringing the cost down, started making much higher quality products, and seeding the market. So they did us all a huge favor, as a matter of fact, because they showed us that you could bring the cost down dramatically in this process and make money. And so, voila, the money word came up, and about 2000, entrepreneurs discovered this industry. You could make money, and it's just been like a wild ride since then. These are all of the startups that have come in there since then, and you could just go on and on with a lot more. The next slide illustrates this graphically. It's an interesting story. These two lines here are market share versus, this is market share versus year of various companies. This is Arco Solar and Shell later, the same company, and Siemens, and BP, okay, who dominated the business back here. In fact, if you go back to the 70s, Arco was like 90% of the world production. They had eaten away at that, but even so, by 94, they still were much larger than anybody else. This is Sharp. This is the Japanese company here, this white line. Sharp finally got serious and just took huge share from the oil companies. They didn't know what hit them, basically, and they started going down. Then along comes the startups. When in about the year 2000, this is Q-Cells here, this blue one, and notice the tremendous growth there. The oil companies continuing to go down, it even caught Sharp by surprise. So all of a sudden, the Japanese companies are trying to figure out what's going on in our cozy little industry. If you fast forward to 07, Q-Cells is actually as big as Sharp. So now that we know the numbers for 07. So it's simply a case where the existing companies didn't recognize the explosive nature of the market growth. And for example, I have friends that were at Shell. Shell was producing about 50 megawatts a year. They wanted to expand. They thought maybe we could expand, we could add 15 megawatts. And they would send that up to the board of directors, and they would, chew on it. It would come back down, and that's too much money. They worked for 3 years trying to get permission to add 15 megawatts. The total market here now is 3 gigawatts, okay, 3 billion watts, and Sharp is at half a gigawatt. We look at Q-Cells is adding hundreds of megawatts a year, so the oil companies simply couldn't move fast enough. SunPower's the little green one there. We actually, this year, moved above all the oil companies and everything. When we decided we needed another factory, we sat around the table and we said, yeah, hey, we need another factory. And we sent our CFO to New York, and he rounded up $300 million, came back. 1 week, we had $300 million. We're starting to build another factory. Shell spent 3 years trying to get approval to build 15 megawatts. So you see the dynamic of the industry just totally shifting. Next slide. So we've had some interesting milestones. This last few years has been, this is a build, so I think there's some important ones that are interesting to know. 1999, as an industry, we built our first gigawatt altogether since the inception. So we had built a total of 1 billion watts of PV panels. It's roughly the size of a power plant, standard conventional nuclear coal power plant. So you could say that the PV industry came of age, I think. We built our first power plant in 1999 of any significance. Of course, that power plant wasn't located in one spot. It was smeared over the entire Earth, but it was the equivalent of a power plant. Then the next, in 2001, this is one that just caught everyone by surprise. We made more square inches of solar cells than the entire chip industry made chips in the year 2001. Now, I can tell you that if you went to Intel or any major chip company, and you have to see the picture because the IC industry thought of the solar industry as basically just a bunch of hippies with gray ponytails, you know, that had never gotten over the 60s. And you told them that, dude, we make more square inches than you. They just laughed, you know. But it was true. And this really started to get people's, you know, attention. My God, this industry is for real. I mean, you know, they're pumping out wafers. The next big milestone, 2004, we got to a gigawatt per year. So in 99, we built a gigawatt since inception. 2004, we're starting to build a power plant a year. Now you're starting to talk, right, about a real industry. In 2006 or 5, the next was 6, we actually used more tons of silicon than the entire IC industry. Now you have to say, why did you not do that when you had more square inches? Well, we make our wafers much thinner than a chip wafer. So we didn't use as much tonnage of silicon, but we processed more area of wafers. But we had caught up because we're growing so much faster. By 2006, we actually used more tons of silicon. This has caused a huge problem in our industry because, like the chip people, the silicon refining companies thought of us like hippies and didn't believe us. The industry always existed off the hand-me-downs from the chip industry. So all through this previous period here, where did we get our silicon? It was rejects from chips, right? We got scrap wafers, got scrap ingots that didn't work quite right. So they always knew that there were these sort of slimy guys that went around to all the chip companies and collected wafers and brought them to the solar companies. So they always knew the solar companies was a place to peddle their junk material. Well, all of a sudden, we're competing with them for silicon on a big way. And fortunately for us, the chip industry had gone into a huge downturn in 2001. So their volume is going down. And the solar just sort of filled it back up. But we kept on growing. And in 2006, the proverbial something hit the fan, and we ran out of silicon. And it's caused a frenzy of activity. It's unbelievable what it's done. The price of purified silicon in 2004, before this happened, was $28 a kilogram. And this recently now, 2007, it's hit $600 a kilogram. So that's on the spot market. The average is lower than that, but the prices, and these guys are impossible to deal with. I mean, you know, in 2004, it's funny in industry how this works. You know, when you're on top and their salesmen come, you line them up in the lobby and say, you know, take a number and you're supposed to go to room 32 and present your proposal, and we might call you back. Now we're the ones doing that, and the deal is that they're giving us is something like this. I never would have believed it. The chip companies are saying, we don't trust you. We don't think you're for real. You want us to build more capacity. So here's the deal. You build the capacity for us in the form of making a prepayment on 10 years of production, 20% of it. We'll build the capacity, and you start getting silicon after 2 years. So you have to lay hundreds of millions of dollars on the table. You don't see any silicon for 2 years. This was, and then they'll start giving it to you. This is another thing that flummoxed companies like Sharp. Actually, the CEO of Sharp just got fired because he couldn't stomach this. You know, the silicon companies were going to Sharp and saying, you know, we don't have any silicon for you, but if you plop down 200 mil, you know, we'll put you on our list. And you know, they just weren't used to being treated like that, and he just basically flipped them off. And all these entrepreneurial companies that had just gone and raised IPO bucks went in and took those deals, and Sharp ended up with not enough silicon, and he ended up without a job.
Dick, why don't we take a few questions right now?
Okay.
It's a good time to pause and take a few questions. So just raise your hand up and I'll bring the mic over so everybody can hear you. Or since you're up front, you can just hand the mic right over to him.
Who do you buy the silicon from?
Oh, okay. So the silicon historically has been made by an oligarchy of basically 5 companies worldwide that produce all the high purity silicon. In Germany, it's Wacker. In the United States, it's Hemlock, which is owned by partially by Dow Corning, and there's a couple in Japan. And what happened is, if I could expound a little bit, when the price went up so high, as our CEO likes to say, capitalism works, and so a whole bunch of people in China started building silicon refining plants. Now these things are not. These are not sort of backyard things. These look like small cities. They're oil refineries with towers and thousands of pipes, and they're square miles in size, one of these refining plants, and they're a big capital project. They're full of all kinds of deadly things. For example, there's one in the U.S. that used to be owned by Union Carbide. Then it was owned by the Japanese. Now it's owned by the Norwegians. Who were the first to buy a silicon plant just to make solar cells. Very smart move. Renewable Energy Corporation. Hot tops. It would have been a hot stock tip 2 years ago. But anyway, I visited them, and they have to locate them in the middle of the nowhere, and they gave us a safety training. And he said, okay, here's the safety rules in our plant. There's an air raid siren. If the air raid siren goes off, you look up, and there's wind socks up there. See which direction the wind is going, and go perpendicular as fast as you can. That was the safety training. Run as fast as you can, crosswise to the wind. It was a good tip. I guess if you can't outrun it. But anyway, they're big operations, and the oligarchic incumbent players were very smug that nobody else could know how to do this. I mean, we had innumerable discussions with the Germans about this. You know, they've been making this for 50 years. You can't make. So then, what they didn't realize is that a bunch of Chinese companies would come in, go to Germany, offer all their key technologists triple salary, and they'd all move to China, right? So all of a sudden, all these Black Forest engineers are in China now, helping China get these things going. So there's tons of poly. It's all going to be coming on this year and next year.
Any other questions before we get into some pictures in the back? I'm coming.
Oh, we want in the back. What?
So one of the first things that comes to mind when you mention tons of silicon is waste. What's the life expectancy of these chips, and then what happens with them once you can't use them any longer?
Good question. We really don't know. The solar cell is thought to last basically forever, but the panel that it's in doesn't. The plastics degrade and the solder interconnections slowly degrade. It's probably about 30 years before the panels would need to be replaced. We warrant them for 25 years. So we're going to have to work out some kind of recycling program, and that has yet to happen because there has been such small amounts that have really, reached the end of their life at this point.
I'm over here on the side, and then we're going to come up front.
Hi. I'm just curious, how is silicon harvested, and if you know, how is it harvested and refined? I mean, obviously, you don't know the secret sauce, but...
No. But I mean, I know the view with the little cartoons on the slide, basically, from you take sand, only you have to find special sand, so part of it is having a good stash, of sand that you like better than anybody else's sand. And then you mix it with carbon, and part of the deal there is to get the good stash of carbon that's better than anybody else's, and then you heat it up and fuse it with an electric arc, and the carbon combines with the oxygen, making carbon dioxide, leaving behind silicon. Sand is silicon dioxide. So at that point you have silicon. The world is awash in silicon. It's used in everything from steels to silicone caulking compounds. That's not the problem. The problem is we have to take it from 99% pure to 7 or 8 nines in more purity. So then you have to refine it. And the way it's done is you mix it with the hydrochloric acid, high temperature, and it creates silicon with chlorine atoms on it. Generally, the one that we try to get is silicon with 3 chlorines and 1 hydrogen, and that's a gas. Okay, and so the gas comes out, and then it's distilled, just like you would distill alcohol. It's condensed and goes through distillation columns, and the things with lower boiling points come out first, and things with higher boiling points go out the top, and you sort of have these tubes that siphon off the highly purified silicon tetrachloride, or trichlorosilane. Now you've got this high purity gas that's mostly silicon with 3 chlorines, and then you have to crack it back to silicon again. And that's done by taking a big bell jar the size of this room, putting silicon rods in that go like this, they're bigger, closing the thing up, running current through those rods and heating them up to thousands of degrees, and then injecting the gas in there, and it knocks the chlorine off, and the silicon precipitates back on these rods, and that runs for a week or so, and then they say they harvest it. Then you have to cool this thing down, open this bell jar up. People go in. It's like a cornfield at that point, and they take all these grown rods out and harvest them.
Sounds really simple and safe.
No. This is just to make the pure silicon. And then there's a whole bunch of people with hammers that knock it into little chunks, and the chunks are melted. And then to make the crystal, you take a quartz crucible, you fill it up with these chunks of pure silicon, and you melt that. And then you stick a seed in, and then you start rotating it, and you pull the seed out, and it just grows this nice crystal.
Wow, I thought making
How it's done.
all those videos of making Gucci wallets is bad. So let's take one more, and then we'll get into pictures. Is that what's next?
I don't know.
Oh, okay.
This is a discovery. Yeah.
Okay, so we'll take one more question, and then we'll get back to the presentation.
Hi, I'm going to cheat and ask two. You can only you don't have to answer both of them. But you mentioned carbon dioxide as a byproduct, so I haven't heard anything about the global warming emissions off of silicon wafer plants, and
Right.
I would hate to have that thrown up, by the coal industry, for example.
Right.
So that's number one, if you could address that. And number two is I'm reading a lot about utility scale solar power plants, which sort of goes back to the original idea, I gather, of build lots of solar out in the desert and transmit it. Could you sort of give us your thoughts on that as well?
Okay. So on the carbon dioxide, I don't have real good numbers on the tip of my tongue. What people compute is what's called the carbon payback time, which is the time the panel has to be out there before it would have emitted less carbon than if you ran a coal plant or some other competitive plant. And those numbers are well known. They're just not known in my brain, but they're quite short, like a month. There's another number that I do know a lot better. I just went through this with the Gore panel. It's called the energy payback time. And that is the time it takes to recover the energy it took to make the panel. Okay? And this is a hot button with me because in 1975, when this whole thing started, a guy from Berkeley wrote an article in Scientific American in which he said that it takes more energy to make a solar panel than it ever produces in its life. And that has stuck with the popular press, and we still get hit with that to this day. A reporter will be interviewing you and say, well, it takes more energy, so I just could. So actually what's happened is it's true that in 1975 that was true. But as the costs have come down dramatically, so has the energy embedded in it. And today it's about 1.5 years for a system. And I think it's going to have again. So it'll be under a year before too long, which is pretty reasonable. It's just annoying that the press can't get it.
Back to the presentation.
Okay, what's next? So this was a little history of SunPower thrown in here for your amusement. So when we started, my vision was to make concentrating systems. I bought into this idea you couldn't make flat plates, and we had to concentrate, and I couldn't figure out how to make a thin film work, so we chose concentrating. There's a picture of one of the dishes we built. That's a dish with mirrors on it, focusing light on the receiver. Those were in Australia. And we had a series of these little projects coming along, but they were all just kind of demonstration projects. And then Honda came to us, and said 1992 and said, well, we know you guys make the world's most efficient solar cells. SunPower was basically formed to commercialize high efficiency technology that was developed at Stanford University, okay, where I was a professor. He said, we know you guys make the most efficient solar cells. Can you make enough to cover our race car, which we're going to race across Australia, solar-powered race car? And we said, sure, although after he left, we realized that none of us had ever made anything in our lives. We were all professors. And we always, you know, if you've ever had any, watched a professor in commercialization, he sort of thinks of making things like an exercise for the student. You know, it's like, I made one, now go make a million. So we didn't know what was involved in that, and that's a long story, but and that's how we started getting involved with Cypress at that point to start helping us. But we made the cells for Honda, and Honda went on to win the race across Australia and got us a lot of publicity. It would have been a good business if there was a race every month, but in fact there was only one every 3 years. So then the race was over. Our vision at that time was to just sort of have a big party, everybody go out, everybody would leave and get a real job somewhere else, and we would go back to being a contract R&D company. But one of the things that happened is that NASA heard about it, and they said, well, we're going to build this solar-powered airplane, and we need your cells bad. And because the regular cells are too heavy and too inefficient, so the airplane won't fly. So we said, okay. So we started working with NASA. It culminated in this project, Helios here, which is a big airplane. You can't get a feeling for it, but the wingspan of that's greater than a 747. It's all solar powered. It flew to 100,000 feet, and which was an altitude record for airplanes. This is a science cafe, so there may be enough nerd critical mass and geeks here to know that actually one airplane went higher than 100,000 feet. Does anybody know what airplane that was? An XR-71 cannot do 100,000 feet.
First one with the right answer gets a beer on me. Now we're going to up the stakes. Now all the answers come out.
Was it the X-21?
It was the X-105, I think, that Chuck Yeager flew.
Wait, F or X?
Was it? I know it was Yeager that flew it.
Oh, no beer
crashed.
for anyone, sorry.
Okay. And it didn't count as an altitude record because he did it by flying up out of the atmosphere and coming around and coming back in. And it was F-10F.
That wasn't 105. They didn't have 105 yet.
This would have been about 1960.
No 105.
Okay, so but the interesting thing is that about that airplane is that they knew that the control surfaces wouldn't work at that altitude, so they had thrusters on the nose to bring the nose down, so that when he hit the atmosphere coming back in, he would hit it like this, and not like this, and he'd be able to restart his engines. But some engineer miscalculated the thrust on the thrusters, and the nose didn't come down. So he entered the atmosphere and he flamed out, and he couldn't restart, and he went into a flat spin and almost got killed. You saw the movie, it was quite dramatic. But anyway, that's the only plane that ever went higher. So then we decided, we made a fateful decision in 2000 to switch from concentrators to flat plate. We had always wanted to do standard flat plate modules. We just couldn't figure out how they did it, because we were buying wafers for $9 to make these solar cells, and if we sold them as solar module wafers, we would have to make them into solar cells and sell them for $5. And you know, even though we were professors, we just knew the numbers didn't work. So we scratched our heads. How do you do it? There's got to be a trick. And we worked on it. And NASA said, you know, we're going to build a whole fleet of these solar-powered airplanes. So we want you to figure out how to make it cheaper. And that array was $6 million for the array, which was our entire revenue for that year. And so we started a project to try and figure out how to make them cheaper. And that's when we figured out how you do it. You make it up in volume, basically. You have to buy enough wafers. I mean, you know, you have to buy enough wafers. You can go to the wafer manufacturer and say $9. So anyway, we figured out how to do it and started trying to raise money. We thought because we had higher efficiency, we had a leg up because for the same wafer would get more power. We had 50% more efficiency than anybody else at that time. We get more power, and we would, you know, when laminating it into the panel, we get more power. So we did the numbers. We said, man, this is going to be gangbusters. I went from the years like in 2000, 99, 2000, I think I went to 40 investment bankers and gave presentations and got, you know, basically the only constructive comment that I got was, have you ever thought about telecom? You know, maybe there's something in the telecommunications network you could make, you know, and we actually were doing that, but to survive. But then I met up with T.J. Rogers, who's the CEO of Cypress Semiconductor, and pitched him. You know, this is like the 48th one or something, and he just got it. It was amazing. He just said, "I've got it. Light goes in, electricity comes out. Silicon. We know silicon." And so, I mean, he didn't try to do like a real fine-grained economic analysis or business case study or anything. You know, just like, yeah, got it. So, so he said, well, it was kind of interesting. I said, well, we're just about to lay everybody off because we're out of money. So he whipped out his checkbook, wrote me a check for $750,000. Said, here, I'll try. That'll keep you going for a while. I'll try and get Cypress to buy it. And he. So he presented it to the board of directors at Cypress, and you know, I want to buy this solar cell company, got the most efficient cells, you know, and then it's just like, what? You know, and you know, TJ has a reputation for being an oddball as it is, but this just sort of like, yeah, gonzo. So they turned him down. Well, he had never had a board proposal voted down by his board of directors, you know, his board of directors. So so he got mad and went into hyperdrive, and it finally culminated in him making a presentation at 2 board meetings later, which was a piece of work like I've never seen. He was on a stage. He had him completely surrounded by solar panels behind him as a backdrop, and he started going. He said he puts up a list. Said, this is a list of all of our largest customers since inception. 1983, 1984, largest customer AT&T. 1985, largest customer. Blah 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 blah. Goes all the way down the list, and he says, "Look at that list. Those are our largest customers. Not one of those companies exists today. They're gone. Cypress, we're still here. Why? Because we make silicon, and solar cells are made out of silicon." And he starts going nuts. And then he says, "I'm Silicon Man," and he pulls out a wafer of silicon, and there's a scale sitting there in front of one of his board, his old guy, Fred Bialik, and he flops the wafer on the scale, and he says, "Fred, how much does that wafer weigh?" Fred goes, it weighs 48 grams. He says, "Grams, I don't want grams." And he reaches over and he starts hitting the scale button. He says, "I want troy ounces." He says, "How many troy ounces does that wafer weigh?" And he looks and says, "Oh, 2." Then he says, "How much is that worth in gold?" Somebody says, $800. He says, "That's it. We turned silicon into gold." And I mean, it was unbelievable. I mean, there wasn't a dry eye in the house, and so they decided they'd buy us, which and the basic idea was that we had this great technology, but we didn't know how to manufacture anything, which was not exactly true. And they had this world-class manufacturing powerhouse, which wasn't exactly true. But by combining the two, we would do it. And in fact, the way we sold the whole thing, remember that Sharp thing with Sharp going into ascendancy? They were just taking off. And we said, look, Sharp is the only PV company out there that has its solar cell company contiguous with its chip plant. So the reason they obviously been able to do this is they're taking modern manufacturing honed in the very competitive chip business, applying it to solar cells, voila, and we could do the same thing. So to this day, I don't know whether that's true or not, but he bought the argument. also said that he would take us public if we met certain milestones. And we did, and he took us public, but not without another huge knockdown with his board of directors. And so he earns my ever-dying respect because he stared him down. They realized by this time that they had something pretty valuable. And he said, no, we're not going to sell this company. And TJ said, I promised those guys if they did it, we take them public. He did. So we went out. It was kind of interesting. We were the first PV company in a long time to go public, and it created quite a sensation. When we went to our underwriters, they were saying, well, this is going to be tough. First PV company, nobody thinks it makes much sense. We think you should probably value your shares at $10. And so we got into a big spat with them and said, no, it's got to be a lot more than that, which would have valued the company at about $500 million. And got to be a lot higher than that, and blah, 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 blah. So eventually we get the roadshow going, and there had been so much pent-up interest in solar. We did the first one started in Europe and worked back, and there was standing room only at every roadshow. After the first 2 meetings, we could have sold every share we had available. We still had a week and a half of presentations to do. Came back all through, and the bankers are going, whoa, we sure missed this. Sorry about that. So then they said, well, we said we got to reprice this deal, and we repriced it to $14. And it was such a big change that we had to refile with the Securities and Exchange Commission. So we had to pull all our prospectuses, rewrite them 24 hours overnight, get them back to the Securities and Exchange Commission, and refile while roadshow guys were flying back from Europe, landing in New York. We refiled at $14, and it was tenfold oversubscribed. Nobody could believe it. By the close the first day of trading, it was up to 27. So the bankers did pretty well, actually.
I'm sure they're not the only ones that did pretty well on that. Being modest. Well, why don't we take a few more questions, actually? Let's open it up, and if you have questions about anything that's been covered so far, or anything that you think it's going to be covered, let's start taking questions now.
So you talked about that solar car that you powered that ran through Australia. And I remember when I was in college a few years ago, we were working on a solar car, and I would hear numbers like maybe 18% of the energy we're hitting the solar cell would get converted to electricity, and that it wasn't that great. And to get 18%, you had to buy like top quality solar cells that were really expensive. Like, what are those numbers at now?
Well, basically, when we built that car, the efficiency was about 23% for the cells on the car, and a standard solar cell was 12 to 13 at that time. Now, this is not your practical car. This is a car which is about this tall, which you lay on your back, and you kind of stare over your belly at the road, and we went fast. I mean, it would go about 100 kilometers an hour, or well over 60 miles an hour, 70 miles an hour. But it was scary as all get out. We took it to the Honda test track, and Road and Track magazine came out and test drove it. Like they tried to test drive cars and stuff, and scared the devil out of it. And these guys are used to like driving Ferraris and stuff, and the guys. But he said it was like driving inside of a snare drum. That was his description of it. But so it's not a practical thing, but it was sure a lot of fun. The students got a lot out of it, and they camped along the way. They went all the way across Australia from Adelaide, from Darwin in the north to Adelaide in the south. Took 5 days through the desert, and they had a lot of fun experiences. One time a kangaroo took exception to one of the cars and walked up to it and just kicked the devil out and smashed it. It was like, what are you doing? But anyway, it was quite an experience.
We got another one here in the back.
So during your history here, when you were talking with NASA about the Helios project, were you guys doing 23% with those cells?
We were. The cells were 23% on the Helios project, but they were made in a chip fab. And they cost, 100 times too much. You know, they were made with lithographic patterning processes. The trick was to figure out how to make a high-efficiency solar cell with cheap processes, and that's what basically.
And was anybody else anywhere near your efficiency rating at that time?
There was one company that was coming in there, and that's Sanyo, which developed a completely different high-efficiency process that's based on a different principle. So it still to this day, Sanyo and SunPower sort of own the high-efficiency space, although there's a number of companies getting ready to. But now that we've shown how valuable efficiency is, we took, just give you an example, we entered the California residential market 2 years ago, and so last year we're #1 in California. There was no way we could have done that with sort of a garden variety, look like Kyocera panel or Sharp panel. Efficiency just gave the sales force much more power than we even. The customers liked it much more than we even anticipated. It took our breath away. And Sanyo's in the same boat, so they're about a point behind us, basically.
What about satellites?
Now, what happened in satellites is same with the solar race cars. Is a new type of cell came along that's called a triple junction cell, based on non-silicon technology, way expensive. I mean, 500 times more expensive than what we're talking about now. Satellites, that works because the math of a satellite is such that the revenue you can generate off a satellite is proportional to the power available, because that controls how many TV transponders you can put on the satellite. And so if you get more efficient panel, you can add more of these transponders that rent for like $5 million a month. I don't know, some big number. So they are willing to pay a lot for efficiency, but it would never make it into the flat panel market, but it did make it into the solar race car market, where the universities were getting rejects from the space cell companies to power their solar race cars. So that transitioned into a very high-end kind of thing with the universities.
We'll take one more here in the back, and then we'll come up front.
Hi. What do you make of, I guess, what I'll call the low-efficiency technologies, the CIGS cells? Do you see the two technologies diverging into niche markets, or do you see one becoming universal and dominant?
Well, that's a real hard question. It's a question that's kind of in play as we speak because of changes. Basically, historically, those thin film technologies that I mentioned that all got started, all the three thin film technologies, if you will, and CIGS is one, amorphous silicon and CAD-TEL are the other two. They all were first reduced to practice in the laboratory in 1974. So they never succeeded in making any significant market penetration. In fact, amorphous silicon made some market penetration in the 80s, mostly for watches and calculators, and then it slowly went down. So you look at it and say, you guys have been competing with this for 30 years. You haven't succeeded in getting any market share. What makes you think it's going to be different? And so the way the conventional silicon industry, I would say, was rather smug about potential competition from these guys. Now, with the success of First Solar recently, that whole thing has changed. But First Solar does cadmium telluride modules, and they have been around for a long time. They've paid their dues. Those guys go way back to the early days of photovoltaics, and they also had big money. The Walton family owned them. So they've come a long way. They've paid their dues. I'm very much less sanguine about the startups that are doing SIGs. It's a hard thing. The thing that makes it hard is it's easy to make a laboratory cell. You make the cell and you go, wow, that's easy. Just scale it up. The laboratory cell is only a centimeter on a side, but we just make the machine bigger and we'll build these big panels. The problem has been in the scale up, and each of these technologies has its own scale up problems. But one of the companies to come into this was Mia Soleil, and they were going to make SIG cells. They are going to make SIG cells, I suppose. And the CEO founded it. I sat on several panels with him, and he actually, frankly, kind of irritated me because he was basically saying, it's time for you scientists to go retire and go fish or something. We manufacturing guys are here. You've been messing around with this long enough. We're going to show you how to do it. And I found it kind of insulting because I had a lot of friends in the SIGS business that worked on it for 20 years trying to get it to work. So when he came out in Fortune magazine 6 months ago, interview, and he said, "Gee, this turned out to be harder than we thought." There was, I don't know, the word that comes to mind is Schadenfreude. I don't know. But now he's actually been fired.
Can you mention really quickly for a lot of us what SIGS is, what that stands for?
Okay, so there's three thin film technologies. Amorphous silicon, which is deposited silicon, but it's not crystalline. And that's used a lot in, the technology was really developed for flat panel displays and xerography and other large-scale applications. And it's kind of funny because it was all developed in Japan. It was invented in the U.S. at RCA Labs. The Japanese took it over in a big way. The U.S. decided that since the Japanese were working on amorphous silicon solar cells, that the U.S. should start working on amorphous silicon solar cells. So we started a big U.S. program. Little did we know that they were just doing it as a cover for flat panel displays. And it worked out pretty well. So that's amorphous silicon. Although things go full circle now, Applied Materials, which is a major tool supplier to the flat panel display industry, is entering the field and bringing their expertise to it. If that technology has any hope, it'll be through Applied and some of those big tool makers coming in. The other two are cadmium telluride. That's the one that First Solar developed. It's cadmium and tellurium. It's a compound of cadmium and tellurium is the active material in there. And then there's a top layer of cadmium sulfide. So that forms the junction. Cadmium sulfide is the anti-cadmium